Good afternoon. My name's Carlo Gébler. When I was young once, and in those days I was in love with literature, with a capital L, written by writers with a capital W. And then I grew up, and I began to understand the difficulties of production. I began to understand, in the words of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, one doesn't often get the chance to quote Lenin, I seize it with both hands. What Lenin said was, whatever else it is, the production of art is always an economic act.
Yeah.
And with this understanding came a change in the focus of my admiration. I began to admire those who toil on Grub Street. I began to admire those who made a living for themselves with what they wrote, a pen or a typewriter or a keyboard. And what I admired was the Sisyphean capacity for endurance. And you may not be on Grub Street, but believe you me, to make a living there requires indefatigable industry and a protean nature. You need to be able to do many things very well. You can't get away with just doing one thing properly. Today, I am flanked by two gentlemen who are the kind of writer I came to admire and continue to admire. This is my old and dear friend, Mr. Self. And Mr. Self has, he's written novels and stories and reviews and lectures and a great deal of non-fiction with a focus on place, sometimes known as psychogeography, and a truly staggering amount of journalism, a frightening, terrifying amount of journalism. And on the other hand, I have Mr. Banville, who I've known and admired for many years. He was, for many years, the editor of the only literary pages worth reading on this island. He is also, that is the Irish Times, he's also a writer with two different identities. He is an essayist, a script writer. You still review?
Oh, yes.
You still review? Yes.
Oh, yes.
You reviewed Ron. Yes. And
still grubbing away.
Yeah. Well, I think that to do the kind of work that they do requires effort of Herculean proportions. We're here today to discuss Dubliners. This is the edition of Dubliners that I first saw, that I first held. It's my father's edition. It was on the shelf of the house where we lived in Misery and Morden. It had his Dublin address, 3 Cabra Grove.
Title of Misery and Morden.
And he bought it when he was working as a projectionist at the Camden Street Cinema in November 1935. I don't know whether this was the actual one I actually first read, but it was certainly the one that I first held. I run a book club in Her Majesty's Prison, Maghaberry, and 2 weeks ago, as our book of the month, we did Dubliners. The favourite story of the prisoners, these are all Category A prisoners, so they're in for a long time, their favourite story was Grace, followed by Clay. Very interesting. So I had to reread this for them and for this today, and as I was rereading it, I was suddenly struck by how many things that we see in literature now I found in this book that was produced, I've just been told by Will, that was published 100 years ago today, on the 15th of June, 1914. So when I was going through it, I kept thinking, you see all that sort of English tradition, the Silito, the brain, the kind of realistic stuff. I see it in this. You see Carver, the idea of omission, leaving things out. You see McGahern and the kind of Irish psychosexual dysfunction. You see, read the kind of really good writing, Elizabeth Taylor, Evelyn Waugh, stuff that you just go, this is fucking fantastic. You see that in it. You see all of these things. Nature writing. The nature writing is fantastic as well. Right up there with Thomas, and I could go on. I'm not really here to talk, these gentlemen are. So, tell me, when did you first encounter this book and how did you find it? And then we'll talk about the stories, and then you will be able to ask questions.
I think my brother and my sister, one or the other, gave it to me when I was quite young. I think I was about 12, 13. And it was a great discovery for me that literature could be about life as I knew it. It didn't have to be the Wild West, or it didn't have to be Agatha Christie. This was a great eye-opener for me. And I used to go to my Aunt Sadie's house down the road and borrow her enormous black Remington typewriter. And I would belt out these hideously bad imitations of Joyce's Dubliners.
Really?
But that was where I started.
You still got them?
No, I threw them away.
Oh, that's a shame.
But I do remember the opening sentence of one of them. Which, I was, 12, 13. What was it? The white May blossom swirled into the open mouth of the grave. It was,
That's fantastic.
Yeah, the start of a grand career, misery and horror. But it was, he was he is still in many ways a great exemplar. Beckett himself, in Beckett's last years, he was asked for a contribution to a festschrift. And he just said, before I go, I bow low before him. And we all do. We have arguments with him. I have arguments with Ulysses. I certainly have fights with Finnegan's Wake, but he still is this extraordinary creature. And Beckett himself said that he was asked what did he appreciate most about Joyce, and he said probity, yeah. And I think that's true.
Yeah, he was infuriatingly young when he wrote these. How did you encounter first Dubliners?
Oh, I really don't know. And I was just, because you'd asked John that, I was struggling to remember.
Oh, fuck, he's coming to me.
Yeah.
Well, we'll just move on then.
I can't remember, and I think this says something about the quality of the stories, is that I think because they are so manifold, and they have, each time you read them, it seems to obliterate the previous reading. So, I can't really remember the first one. I'm not sure that I would have detached them in my mind at the time. I should imagine I must have read Dubliners in my late teens, but I'm not sure that I would have discriminated that much. I think I was shocked because I read it relatively late, so it's not, 17, 18, something like that. I think I already was, prey to the idea that Joyce was impossibly difficult. So I remember reading Dubliners, and I think I was already, into Portrait and Ulysses as well, if not Finnegan, being shocked by the clarity of the writing. But no, I don't have a memory of reading it for the first time, and I must have read it since then at least 5 or 6 times.
Why do you reread it?
Auden notoriously used to write marginalia GETS, gets, in the margins of books, which stood for good enough to steal.
Oh, yes.
And so I mostly reread it to steal stuff, obviously.
Yeah.
It's such a cliche to say that a text reveals something new every time you read it. You could argue that, a sort of article, anything could reveal to you something new each time you read it. But I think I don't read a great deal of fiction because I find it tends to get in the way of my own fictional impulse. It's either like watching a seal balance a ball on top of its nose, which is exhausting if you spend most of your day doing that yourself. You don't really want it. It's not a way to wind down. Or else it's being prey to the anxiety of influence. And if any writer tells you that she or he doesn't suffer from the anxiety of influence, then they're a stone cold liar. Because, but I think with Joyce, and actually particularly with Dubliners, because while, the level of formal innovation in the other works is incredible and formidable, and he does all sorts of stuff, there's something about the particular kind of innovations that I think are involved in Dubliners at a book that are very, very startling, because they break up your perception of literary time as being, in some sense, diachronic, it being a straightforward historical time, because some of the stuff that he's doing in this book, he's writing in the early 1900s, people didn't catch up with until the 1960s and 70s, as you were saying in your introduction. And so it remains good enough to steal. Carlo and I had dinner last night, and we were talking, and the image we were thinking of at the end of a painful case, I thought, well, that's good enough to steal.
That's the train, like the snake, when he sees the copulating couples in Phoenix Park.
And he's standing, and he sees the train coming out of the city, and the train is anguiform, it's snake-like or worm-like, and of course it's the worm leaving both the rotting body of Dublin and the rotting body of Mrs. Sinico, this woman who he has really rather used, I think we can feel. He's treated her appallingly, and she's committed suicide, of course, by throwing herself in a Karenina-like act. Actually, the suicide, again, very Joycean touch, is described through a newspaper clipping with incredible, the slowness, the fact that was it a tram or a train, actually?
It's a train.
It's a train
At
moving,
Dorking, isn't it?
moving very slow.
Yeah.
Kingstown,
I thought it was a tram, but there you are.
But I'll just declare a personal interest. A Painful Case is my favourite story because of its categorical and pitiless bleakness.
I've always been fascinated. It seems to me that there are two self-portraits in Dubliners. There's Gabriel Conroy in The Dead, and the protagonist in A Painful Case, who is Gabriel Conroy is the fatuous side of Joyce as he saw it himself, and the character in A Painful Case is his aesthete side. Yeah, his alter ego. He's writing little
Nietzschean squibs.
Yes, and I think that he was. I may be wrong. It seems to me there's a certain amount of self-disgust in that, and he knew that he needed something, and the something came. I'm always convinced in the form of Nora Barnacle. Nora Barnacle literally took him in hand and made a man of him. And I think that she, I suppose she has been given her due now, but she wasn't certainly in Ellman's biography. I think she was the great discovery. He discovered in her the flesh of the world. He'd had so much of the mind of the world. And of course he was going to the stews and he was sleeping with prostitutes and so on. But he needed this wonderful woman who could laugh at him. And that's what every aesthete needs. When you're 23-year-old aesthete, you need a laughing woman.
One of the things that struck me when I reread it was its structure. I mean, it is a collection of stories, and The Dead was added later. But there's something in it. It's a sort of it's a shelving beach. And you get into the sea slowly. And first of all, you read Sisters and Evelyn, and it's sort of, it's depressing, but straightforward. And then you go, the water is rising, and it gets worse. A story like Two Gallants is just horrible.
Well, Two Gallants is the most conventional story in some ways. It's a story that has a hook, after all. It has a MacGuffin in it. It has a twist. You assume that they're involved in some attempt to share the girl sexually, but of course it turns out they're simply getting her to steal from her employers, and how much worse and more desperate that is. You know, even when you're contemplating these two young men and you think that they're going to sexually exploit the young woman, you can kind of see, I mean, it's not a laudable motive for their behaviour, but it has a kind of earthy simplicity about it. But when you realise their desperation is such that they're not remotely interested in her sexually, and if you remember, there's the description of the girl that is not a sexual description, you then realise later, but a description of her as a person who's capable of being honest enough to be dishonest. You know, so it's an essay of her. But coming back to what John was saying, I mean, about the two self-portraits and the picture of him that he gives, if it is indeed a self-portrait in a painful case, he has this marvellous phrase where he says, of the protagonist, I can't remember his name, of course. I can't remember, the names of my children. Why would I remember? Actually, I suddenly double took that because I remember, I think, one of my children's birthdays today. Anyway, really? They'll forgive me. Yeah. I'll explain what I was doing. He says of himself, or again, it's a rather complex idea because he writes with inflected monologue in a lot of this. So there's a sense in which the authorial persona is both merging with the characters and detaching from them. Often in the course of a single paragraph, there will be some attempt, there will be this strange stereoscopic effect where, the voice is inflected by the character and then moves away from the character. So with that protagonist, he says of him that he liked to compose sentences about himself in the third person and the past. And that trope just left me breathless again reading it, because I thought, here is a 23, 24, 25-year-old young man able within a single trope in a few sentences to both be diacritical about his own methodology and about what literature does and provide a self-portrait, but not a self-portrait of himself as he was then, but as, in a sense, what he knew he would become.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the received wisdom is that Mr. Duffy in Painful Case is a portrait of Stanislaus Joyce, his brother, but I don't think look, it's ridiculous to talk about all fiction is autobiographical and not autobiographical at the same time. I think that you're right, and that was what fascinated me when I read the book first. Of course, I didn't realize it was what fascinated me, but his classical distance, the way that a very young man like that, when we were young men, I'm sure you both the same as me, we felt that we had to expose our souls, tell ourselves to the world. Joyce in these stories, much more than in Portrait of the Artist, was able to stand back and do this extraordinary classical vision of things. It's absolutely beautifully done. And that was one of the things that I think inspired me, as I say, in retrospect. He had that marvellous style that he'd learned from Newman, he'd learned from his classical education, he'd learned to think very early on. But he was in danger of becoming, we've all known extraordinarily clever people who were, 19, 20, 21, the best boy in the class, the guy who went on to get a double first at Oxford, did all these things, and then was never heard of again. I think Joyce realised that was a danger for him. And going away from here, going to Paris, taking all those risks, he was scared. If you read the account of his first trip to Paris, he was terrified, as Beckett was as well. I mean, they kept thinking, God, I'll go home to Mammy. And, of course, Joyce was called home to his poor old dying Mammy. But he was, from the start, extraordinarily controlled. My problem with Joyce is, to move things along a little bit, is that he became less controlled as he went on.
The later books?
Yeah. And I think that was a great loss.
We have to restrict ourselves to Dubliners.
Why?
Because that's what they told me.
You think it's
fly the nets of these?
Yeah, fly past the nets. Yeah.
I mean, I can't read Finnegan's Wake at all.
Do you think?
Good
Do you
little-
think, John, it's like our mutual friend Martin Amis said instead of William Burroughs that, you want a writer to be in the control tower at the airport, directing the traffic, not running around on the runway waving his arms. And do you feel later Joyce is running around on the runway?
Well, the strange thing about, you realise when you've written a few books that it suddenly strikes you that you are the only person in the world who can't read this book that you've written. Everybody else can read it, but you can't. With Finnegan's Wake, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
Joyce was his own ideal reader. There are people in this room who will cut my throat if I suggest otherwise.
We won't allow it.
But I feel that he departed from the human scale. And that, in an artist, is disaster. Is he here?
Yeah. He is. He's at the back.
Sorry, Jimmy. I take it all back.
Banville killed at Joyce Centre. The respected Irish writer John Banville was murdered today at the Joyce Centre by an enraged scholar of Finnegan's Wake who partially severed his head before.
Was one of the things that we were talking about last night, which might be connected with it, is his, what could be described as cinematic élan, his ability to organise people in space, to get people in and out of rooms, up and down stairs, get their coats on and off, all that kind of technical stuff. Often he will leave out vital bits of information, so you just jump from one thing to the next. But in other cases, like in The Dead, the whole party, and parties are a nightmare, but he's
good at blocking.
Very good at
blocking.
But his eyes weren't very good. And Will's theory, well, you tell us what you think.
Well, I think he needed to know where everybody was. I think one of the problems is socially, if you're incredibly short-sighted, is that you need to retain an idea of where everybody's location is in the room. And my theory is, because if you read the Dubliners with some attention, you will see that the blocking is in fact magnificent.
It's incredible.
And it reminded me also of something Michael Hoffman, Kafka's translator, said about the way Kafka writes, because Kafka, who, in many ways, you might struggle for where Kafka and Joyce meet and march together, but they march together in that area of blocking. Hoffman calls it, in respect of Kafka time, because he's so good at calibrating time and movement in prose. But Joyce is equally good. And I think if you have reasonable sight, you don't really look. Because you know that when people start moving, you'll be able to respond to their movement. But if you try and imagine what it's like to be partially sighted, which is what Joyce effectively was, you need to establish people's positions so that when they move, you can judge how they've moved. And you're using your ears a lot. And if you go back and read one of the stories in Dubliners this evening, and obviously remember what we've all been saying with great acuity, then you will see that what he does is to coordinate sound and vision. All the time there is an analogue of movement that is either the visual, some sort of visual alteration, or it's sound, that the sound is coming from a different position, or something, point Carlo made, light sources. Yeah. He's fantastically good on where the light is coming from. He's like the antithesis of when you see contemporary period films of the period before electric lighting, and it's all fantastically well lit, and you think, it really wouldn't have been like that. He's the inverse of that. In a low light environment, he's a partially sighted man who needs to know where everything is.
Yeah, that's
but
a very good point.
As the sight goes, he becomes more...
Yeah.
Well,
it becomes more musical, it becomes more inward.
And you more inward, and you end up with Finnegan's Wake.
Yeah. But
I think theory.
I think that's true.
Scholars note.
But one of the great puzzles and one of the great miracles in the modernism of the first half of the century is the transition that Joyce made between the rather precious young man who wrote, not youngish man who wrote Portrait of the Artist, and the extraordinarily Rabelaisian writer who emerges in Ulysses. And you know, the only texts that are there are those little pieces he wrote, Giacomo Joyce, which are sort of impressionist sketches. How did he transform himself from that young aesthete into this extraordinary, such confidence, such control, and such breadth? I mean,
well, are you saying he had to do this as
well,
part
you
of
see,
the way that got himself?
one of the things that puzzles me is that if he had written Ulysses after Dubliners, I would think, yeah, that's a natural progression. And in fact, Ulysses started out as being a sequel to The Dead. But in between came Stephen Hero and Portrait of the Artist, in which he becomes, as I say, a rather precious fin de siècle aesthete. But he killed that in himself in order to write Ulysses. And I've read the biographies, read them all, but I still find no explanation of how he made that transition. He was on his own, he'd no one to talk to, except Nora, and Stanislaus would come now and then, but that was mostly about money. So how did he make this extraordinary transition? I don't pretend to have any answer to this, but it is one of the most fascinating progressions of an artist, very quickly in that period.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure that you can't see a line going through Portrait from Dubliners, but I think that I agree with you, they do logically. The fascinating thing for me about considering the time Dubliners was composed was his capacity to abandon wholesale all literary language in Dubliners. And if you think of the period he's writing, when books, even the most advanced books, come with all sorts of furniture, all sorts of linguistic mouldings and kind of furbelows and cornices that are put on them, and it's like, page 1 of Dubliners, blimey, Danish modern has arrived. It's completely sans phrase, no circumlocution, straight in there. It could have been written now. It has all of the virtues we associate with modernity, the capacity for direct and unadorned writing are there. I'm not quite so sure I agree with you that Portrait, John, is I think the extent to which one sees it as the work of a precious young aesthete surely is because he is so adroit at doing the portrait. So it starts off wonderfully, goes through the childhood, marvelously naturalistic 19th century realist writing, and then the character becomes obsessed with himself as this heroic figure who's going to, take the wings and fly away and do it, which is a lot of nonsense, frankly. He wanted to go to Paris. He didn't want to be here. It wasn't such an heroic journey as he portrays it, and in that, this is really heretical. Joyce gave, I think, the best definition of sentimentalism that there is. That sentimentality is unearned emotion, and I feel that in the closing chapters of Portrait, it's unearned emotion. He's pumping himself up into this grand figure. And Ibsen, I think, was a very bad influence on him. I love the story of Chekhov storming out of an Ibsen play saying, life is nothing like this, nothing like this. And it was Joyce's great discovery was how to write about life as it actually is, which he did in Dubliners and he did in certainly the first third of Ulysses. And this is a very great discovery. And again, I say, I don't know how he did it. Not that I want to, or not that I expect to, but I still think it's something worth remarking.
Well, I have no idea. I'm not a Joycean scholar, but possibly it was the First World War. He wasn't involved in it, but maybe that's why he decided to destroy the estate, because something so dreadful had gone on, and he did know it was going on. He wasn't completely indifferent.
Well, I was looking in Ellman's biography. The letters that Ellman quotes between James and Stanislaus Joyce at the time that Joyce is writing Dubliners, which is written very fast. It's written in about 6 months. I'm not sure about your point about the Dead. I mean, he wrote the Dead consecutive with the rest of
But
the
he
stories.
did it after it was an add-on, I think.
I don't know
Well,
whether
The Dead was quite late. The Dead was written about a year, 18 months after
Really?
the rest of the stories. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But he writes a letter during the period
But it
when
was written very quickly, and it was written when he was sick. He was very sick.
But
I mean, ill. I don't mean.
yeah,
Will, carry on.
no. I mean, I'm just thinking about writing the Dead when you're not feeling well.
Well, that's what he'd do when he wasn't feeling well.
Right.
Think about when he was on song.
But your point, anyway, these letters are they are the letters of a young aesthete, and they are the letters of a self-regarding, slightly precious young aesthete. And Stanislaus is always his conspirator in that role and in the devising of that persona and its augmentation. And don't you think, John and Carlo, that Joyce had this capacity for entering fully into the performance of his self-mythologizing, but also being quite separate from it at the same time? It's an astonishing kind of mental diplopia that he's engaged in, and that gives you some of the kind of psychic valency that produces this sort of prose.
Yes, but he couldn't have done the portrait of Stephen Dedalus that he does in Ulysses if he had carried on, if he had continued to be the same kind of writer who wrote Portrait of the Artist.
Yes,
he couldn't have done. He wouldn't have taken that ironic, mocking. He couldn't have done that. In Portrait. The whole edifice would have collapsed. One belly laugh, and the last third of Portrait of an Artist would have collapsed. But Ulysses begins with belly laughs. That's what. Sorry, I'm becoming one trick pony here.
No, why not?
Whatever, just going on about the same thing. But it does fascinate me. It does fascinate me that how he did that. I mean, we all remember. We make comparisons. I remember trying to write, as I say, these bad imitations of Dubliners, and spending my teenage years trying to write something, just trying and failing and trying and failing. Joyce seems to have flown that particular net. He seems to have leapt over that. Now, I'm not saying it was easy for him. God knows. Nobody would ever pretend writing is easy. But something happened. And maybe it was the zeitgeist. Maybe it was that, he moved to Europe. Suddenly he was free. But, he was in Trieste, which wasn't exactly the centre of the world. I remember the first time I arrived in Trieste, I looked around and said, Jesus Christ, it's Dublin.
Yeah. But do you not think also, I mean, looking at the zeitgeist, looking at the period, you're talking about a period both here in Dublin and in Britain at the time when the petty bourgeoisie are feeling incredibly squeezed between the rising labour movement and the demands and exigencies of capital. There is a real sense in Western Europe of the potential imminence of revolution and of the danger of being sucked under into a kind of lumpen proletariat or of actual revolutionary tumult. And Joyce's particular young life experience of this extreme shabby gentility, this experience of effectively poverty, but dressed up in the guise of being middle-class people with connections and education, is the impetus to this particular kind of realism. He had an urgency and a desire to depict the reality of people's lives because of the disjunction in his own life. Here he was, a scholar at University College, writing these lauded essays and having to do the moonlight flit every week. And you've got the scene in Portrait, actually, where he comes home and finds all the children, his brothers and sisters, eating a bit of stir-about round a table. I don't think they've even got plates. That must have been a strong motivation for him to write these portraits of the Dublin that he knew and to bring it into focus.
I mean, modernism sprang out of the sickness of Europe, sickened with boredom, sickened with itself, sickened with peace. We love war. It's energizing. It was one of the many things Nietzsche was right about. He had to
Yes, I
It's
What did I say?
No, it's just one of those phrases, one of the many things Nietzsche was right about, and you think, he was also good on how to tile a kitchen.
Yeah, well, he probably was.
Yeah.
I forgot what I was
Sorry,
saying, but it's-
sorry.
Yeah, we were
It's
sick.
probably just as well.
Modernism was a reaction. Everyone was sick.
Yeah.
And
Well, sickness sickness is amazingly productive. We've all had that experience when we were kids, for instance. You get a dose of flu or whatever those mysterious childhood illnesses we got, and we'd be in bed for 3 days, and your mummy would come and give you all these hot drinks and so on, and you knew that you were just positioning yourself, that this sickness is kind of launch pad. And if you apply that to Europe in general, that kind of sickness was a launch for a whole new way of looking at the world, a whole new way of making art. And of course, Joyce gloried in being, he said himself, I'm a bourgeois man. I don't, my friends are not artists, my friends are, ordinary people, although he also said, quite rightly, there's no such thing as an ordinary person. But, a new humanity came. A lot of the modernists, one of the things I find really objectionable about modernists is where they're constantly, kicking the bourgeoisie. They're supporters. They're, the Harriet Weavers of the world, were required. Bourgeois people were required in order to allow artists to have the luxury of kicking them. But it was a bourgeois world, and all the modernists were bourgeois people. They were all 19th century bourgeois. But he does find a new humanity. The little scene, one of my favourite scenes of all in Ulysses, is where he meets his sister at the book barrow on the quays. I think it's the most beautiful. It's only about a page or something. It's absolutely beautiful. And all of Joyce's humanity is distilled in that. He doesn't make any big efforts. He doesn't make a big scene. It's precisely because it's so small. That's what he had learned to do in Dubliners. That's what sustained him through so much in Ulysses. But when he goes into the gigantism, which he did in the second 2/3 of Ulysses, that's where I feel that he loses. Certainly for me, he loses something. Okay. But that probably is
it's
more
the
than
reverse
we came here to talk about.
Synecdoche. I mean, you might say that the great skill then in Dubliners, in parts of Ulysses, we'll set portrait to one side because I don't think we altogether agree on that, is he's great at showing the whole in the part, but not so good at showing the part in the whole. That's when he loses his equity. But I also think there's technology in Dubliners. It's hidden, but it's there.
The technology is superb. I mean, that's
and the registering of technological shift that is occurring at the time. So there's very few mentions of technology in Dubliners, but they're very telling. And one of them is in
motor car.
There's the car race, very reminiscent actually of a Kafka piece called The Air Race at Brescia, which is actually not dissimilar to this story. And
it's very like it.
And written at more or less the same time, a bit later. Kafka's piece is 1908, so if you want to read that would be good. But then there's the mention in Grace of the sermon on the poem that the Pope has written about the photograph.
Photograph, yeah, in Latin.
In Latin.
Yeah.
It's very significant. There is the light switch in the hotel room in The Dead, or the tap, as it's referred to as they go in. There is the motor car race. There is the train death of Mrs. Sinico, though I suspect that isn't. Do you think that's a self-conscious reference to Anna Karenina?
She's trying to cross the track. She's not trying to kill herself, is she?
She's drunk.
She's drunk.
She's drunk, yeah. She's just made a mistake. We all do.
And of course, there's the fact that, and Carlo and I were talking about this last night, that the scrivener in Counterparts, the fact that he is a scrivener, it's the 1900s, and his job is as a copyist. And we were saying we'd always puzzled about the title of Counterparts, but in fact the counterpart is that ghastly kind of psychic congruence between the way that he is abused by the Ulsterman who's in charge in the bank, and then he goes home and abuses his child. but also that the counterpart is a reference to his job as a copyist. He is required to produce the counterpart of the document.
Because apparently a document wasn't legal if it was typed.
Is that right?
Yeah, it had to be written. Let's just go back to, this was written 1904, 1905, 1906, 7. And the war, First World War, started 7 years later. And one of the things that struck me rereading it was his genius when it came to exposition. If you take a story like Grace or Ivy in the committee room, especially Grace, you know, you've got a man has an accident, then you have Mr. Power who saves him, then Mr. Cunningham, Mr. Power's friend, and Mr. Fogarty who has the shop, Mr. McCoy who doesn't have any money, has to borrow people's suitcases. But it's really complicated. There's really complicated back stuff that he has to tell you about all of these men, which you need to know, because that gives you great pleasure when you have them all assembled at the end, at Father Purdue's sermon at the retreat. And it's done brilliantly. Bit of story, here's a bit about Mr. Cunningham. Bit more story, now meet Mr. Power. And on it goes. And you acquire the knowledge you need to acquire in order to get through the story, like a child learning a language. It just comes. You never have to go, who's this? Which one is that? That ability, that level of control, in someone of 24, is fantastic.
Ah, yes, but he also does something else that's
Genius.
kind of unfashionable. And if you're fool enough to go to a creative writing class, they will tell you things like, you don't want to physically describe characters too closely because the reader likes to be able to invent her own version of the character, and you don't want to over-determine. Joyce describes people's faces with pinpoint accuracy. You know, I mean, you can be in no doubt what people... So when he introduces a character, he gives you a photographic level of identification.
Yeah, but you know, if you read it, and especially if you read Ulysses, there are no descriptions.
But there are in
never
this.
described. It's done by dialogue. It's done by Joyce. One of my mottos as a writer is from Cato the Censor. He said, "Rem tene verbum sequenter," grasp the object and the word will follow. And Joyce was a master of that. He always saw what he was writing. He never, even though he was drunk on words, drunk on language, he never let it get in the way of what he was describing. That's, to me, that's the essence of Joyce's genius. That the world, the physical, grubby, fleshy world is caught in that extraordinary language. And he does it with very few descriptions. I know he doesn't in this, but again, that's one of the things that puzzles me about the change that he went through by the time he got to do Ulysses. There are almost no descriptions. It's very odd. And yet you see the people. Bloom is never described. Never described. Never, ever.
What do you think he looks like?
Well, of course, there's a little drawing that
Mr. Bloom.
Joyce did of him in his bowler hat and his moustache and so on. But that's not in the book.
So that's where we get the fact we all think he looks like sort of Andrew Sachs playing Monsieur Poirot.
Yeah.
But you see, that's the great genius of a great and monumental, terrifying ego. That Joyce says to us, I have seen this. I know what this looks like. I don't have to describe it to you. The mere fact that I know what it's like is going to come across to you from the page, and it does by some strange magic that I don't understand.
Isn't that, though, the logical counterpart to, if you look at a story like Ivy Day in the Committee Room? Well, Ivy Day in the Committee Room, it's like when the trouble started in Ukraine over the last few months, and I kept thinking to myself, why doesn't somebody give William Hague and John Kerry a copy of Mikhail Bulgakov's The White Guard? Because actually that's as good a way into understanding Ukraine now as it was when Bulgakov wrote it in the 1920s. You know, there are some historical constants here. Do you not think that with a story like Ivy Day in the Committee Room, you could really with a properly annotated copy of that story, you could understand just about all you needed to know about Irish politics in the late 19th century.
And yet the strange thing about that story is it's one of the most inconsequential in the whole volume. Nothing happens. Absolutely nothing happens. There's no beginning, no end. It's not a story. In
But
it's
isn't
just
that
a
the
little
point?
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. But again, it's masterly from that. It's a technique without technology.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that in that story, I mean, if you read it without a heavily annotated copy and you don't know quite a bit about Irish politics of the late 19th century, you might not know what the hell was going on. You certainly don't know about all of the kind of political allegiances and how they stand in relation to Parnell and the extent to which they're nationalist, the extent to which the nationalist cause is corrupted by local politics. Classic Dublin pork barrel politics of one kind or another is rolling over idealism, and it's still, I mean, that's the other point about Ivy Day. It's probably just as relevant to contemporary politics in this town as it was to politics then. But Joyce doesn't give you any context at all, not interested in context. So is there not an analogy between, in Dubliners he says, it's not necessary to explain the social and political context like the classical 19th century novel like Eliot or whoever, to kind of set and setting and then start moving your characters around in a predetermined realist environment. You just give them, you just present them, and then that will carry the day. Once you know, as you say, once the thing is grasped, the wider context will either swim into view or not, depending on the reader. When he gets to Ulysses, he's gone even further. He's now saying, I don't even have to describe to provide a visual analogue for the reader, because that in itself is a convention that I know. Just grasp the thing even more firmly, and I can abandon physical description as well.
Well, that was the great revolution that modernism brought about, modernism literature anyway, that before that, literature was about things. But as Beckett said about Joyce, he's not writing about something. What he writes is the thing itself. That was a huge shift. And Joyce was very much, but as I say, Joyce did that on his own. He was over there in Trieste. He was, he was in Europe, but he may as well have been here. He may as well have been in Gorey. But he did it himself. I think that's his great, admirable. It's the thing I admire most about him.
He doesn't. Yeah.
Somebody playing a Jew's
Well, that's
harp.
we're the warm-up act.
Yeah, I know.
That's what's coming.
Yes, the band is on
something really good and superior.
It's a strange sort of homage to Leopold Bloom playing a Jew's harp, but I suppose it's the same. Yeah.
I know, yeah.
But
I suspect it's...
he doesn't.
Nothing down there is happening unself-consciously.
No.
Everything that's happening there is planned and referenced to something else.
Absolutely.
So it would seem.
I think that the reason he... there may not be that much physical detail, but the physical detail is unforgettable. So the beginning of Grace, where the figure of Mr. Carney is described as his suit is covered with the ooze and slime of the toilet floor, and the medallion of blood on the tiles. I mean, the idea of that suit and that what it's saturated with never leaves you. That's all he really has to do. He just has to give you that one detail and you've got the rest. We've been speaking for an hour.
Have we?
Yeah, it's incredible. You wouldn't believe it, would you?
How it passes.
Yeah.
I was having fun.
Yeah, and these ladies and gentlemen might want to ask us something.
We've really been speaking
Well,
for
since
an hour.
we started at 3:15, didn't we?
Well, that's probably within 55 minutes.
Okay, we've been doing 55 minutes. Maybe some of you have some questions. Yes.
Yeah, so as we were talking earlier about Joyce's simplicity in Dubliners and the economy of the words he uses, I was puzzled with a story like An Encounter, which was so simple on the surface and evidently a portrait of life as it happens. But underneath that veneer of simplicity, there's something far more sinister going on. And this sense of something sinister underneath the surface is something that endures throughout most of the stories in Dubliners. So how much of Joyce's simplicity is really him being clear, and how much of the simplicity is just a sort of mask behind something much more complex?
No, it's a very good point. That's a good point. That's not... I suppose it's a question as well, but I'd prefer to see it as a point. But if I were to see it as a question, I'm beginning to sound like a Sir Arthur Street Greebling.
No, please don't.
Has anybody asked you, Sir Arthur, a question that you'd always wanted to be asked? Don't go there. I think that is to do with the way Joyce tackles the taboos of his culture of the time, because, you know, that story is about two boys, you know, nearly getting sexually molested when they've played truant, okay? Throughout Dubliners, Joyce writes extremely effectively about a hypocritical society of sexual repression and moral dubiety at the highest level. And the way he does it is by using simplicity as a matador's, a toreador's sort of cloak to kind of trick the reader into believing that everything is completely clear and that you can see everything. And because you can see everything, you can also see the hypocrisy of the culture that he's operating in. And we need to remember, of course, that while Joyce completed the stories around 1906, he then had to wait another 8 or 9 years to get them published. And the key things, you're right to raise an encounter, because that was the story that was most objected to. Though the other two things are both in Ivy Day in the committee room, and they're the references to the then Prince of Wales that were violently objected to, and doubtless the ambassador still violently objects to. He's probably come here to check that we don't read them aloud.
Yeah.
I mean, we've already been thrown out by the Catholic Church, and now the British state is on hand to do the same.
I've spent a lot of quality time in my life with paedophiles, and many years, and
out of choice.
out of choice. Yes, it's what I like to do. And there's
there's nothing sinister about it.
The way the man talks in an encounter, that combination of the risible and the sinister, is so true. If I met a boy who was keen on a girl, I'd give him such a whipping as a boy would never have known before, whatever it is he says. I mean, it is bonkers, and it's it makes your blood run cold. I mean, he's really, all I can say is he is absolutely right.
What is one of the many remarkable things about Joyce, and you're absolutely right there, is that most artists live with other artists, whether physically or in their minds.
Yeah.
And we really only write about, let's call it commonplace life, under protest. What we really want to write about is the inside of our minds. Joyce had that extraordinary capacity to be infinitely interested in trivia. And all those stories there are common experience. There's nothing in there that we haven't all experienced. And this is this was the thing that struck me, to go back to the very beginning of the conversation. This is what struck me when I was a boy, a kid, early teens, reading this, that here was somebody writing about ordinary life and making literature out of it. You were saying that in those early stories, it's depressing. As usual, the paradox of great art, that it may be about depressing things, but the stories themselves, the art itself, is immensely vivifying.
Oh, I love depression.
Yeah, I know that's what you meant, and it is depressing in a way if you think about it. But the art itself, and of course, this is the difficulty that all artists have to deal with. How do you write about something? If you want to write about gloom, you have to do it in a way that is illuminated. So, what you get in art is not feeling; it's what feeling feels like. Mm-hmm. And Joyce is a master at giving you that. He fools you into thinking you're not getting what feeling feels like. You think you're getting feeling itself. Of course you're not. But it's a great trick.
I think he was helped in that by being a bit of a perv himself, though, wasn't he? Don't you think, John? Because he...
Unlike the rest of us, Will.
Yeah. Well, you've got to have the courage of your own perversions, I feel. I know I do. But I mean that quite seriously. He was a fetishist himself, and he understood that fetishes. He understood intuitively the Freudian view of fetishization, that it exists to canalize and control desire, because desire is too powerful unless it's modulated in that way. But it also meant that it gave him this kind of laser eye into people's sexual psychology, which he deploys.
Yeah, but my objection to that would be that makes him seem an intellectual, and whereas he started off as an intellectual and was going to be a lifelong intellectual, he changed that. He stopped being an intellectual. He ceased to be interested in ideas. Throughout Ulysses, the ideas that he was obsessed with when he was young are constantly being mocked. And the life of the flesh that Leopold Bloom lives, and even Molly Bloom lives, this is what is celebrated. And that again is, I cannot understand how he made that transition. I'm sorry to be a bore about
Genius.
that. But I think, well, genius is, what is genius?
That's just a deus ex machina. I mean, you can't, genius isn't something apart from any other kind of ability. It can only be an intensification of it in that sense.
Do we have any more questions?
No.
Yeah. Oh, yes, we do.
Could you tell us why you think the prisoners preferred Grace and Clay?
Right. Clay, they were really interested in whether or not the Colonel figure had stolen Mariah's cake. They were convinced that he'd stolen the cake.
Being a bunch of thieves.
Yeah, well,
themselves.
these people were rather think thieves and
Professional
then,
interest.
yes,
Yeah.
we'll go rather.
What was the MO for
Yeah.
stealing the cake?
Yeah, well, I mean, she was an old woman and there was the opportunity. They liked all that, and they were very taken with the idea of playing the trick on her and her humiliation. Grace...
Well, they start off trying to play the trick on her, but they don't want to humiliate her in the end. I mean, it's going to get out of control.
They are rebuked, and it is
And
stopped.
she is allowed to maintain her dignity because
They don't want to embarrass themselves.
Yeah.
Slightly different.
You think?
They don't show themselves up.
Yeah.
They realise
And they don't want
overstepped.
awkwardness. It's an occasion, so they don't want...
And prisons are great places for, jokes and jolly japes. I mean, one day I was sitting in a cell and a man came in and said, "Look at my little mouse," and he put a huge ball of fluff from a floor buffer that he'd collected, and he'd made a tail and everything. I nearly jumped through the fucking ceiling. Yeah, but it was just fluff. So that's the jokey side. They liked Grace because they liked the idea of the collective forgiveness. They liked the idea that you could, go in and you get spoken to sensibly because they're all guilty. They know that, and they want to be relieved of their guilt because they have done something terrible.
They want a bit of hypocrisy applied to them.
Yeah, but
No, to be out in the world being forgiven for things you shouldn't be forgiven for.
Yeah. Does that answer your question? I hope so. Ah, yes.
I want to ask a question about knowing everything and an artist's job of knowing everything, and the well-documented idea that Rebecca's solution to Joyce's encyclopedic aesthetic was a dignified resignation. Okay, let's look at not knowing everything. But in this sort of whatever it might be called postmodern era, there's a sort of return, Thomas Pynchon-esque return to okay, let's maximalist total artwork. I was wondering about this idea of the anxiety of influence as a modernist idea, because you just knew the heritage, but it was just white men. Whereas now it's the anxiety of the choice of influence. Do I look at which colour, everything? So I was wondering what, as an artist, what's the responsibility towards this idea of knowing everything? I know recently the stuff you wrote about the novel is dead. So maybe it's another art form that will take up this mantle, which Joyce seems to be an example of the total aesthetic.
Yes. I didn't say the novel was dead. That was the sub-editor at The Guardian, who's, I'm sure, his or her opinions on most things are just as valid as my own, but that was not my heading for that article. I said that the novel would become a minority interest on a par with classical music or easel painting. I think that's absolutely the case, the serious novel. I mean...
And a good thing, too.
Absolutely.
Gentlemen.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you look at the arc of Joyce's career, then what it reflects is how in the 20th century prose fiction did come to be the central artwork of Western culture, and that is a position that is now being ceded, and yes, I've no doubt it will, some other artistic form will arise that will do that job for people. I don't think people are going to be without it. But I would disagree with you slightly on the kind of Beckett-Joyce dichotomy. I think what Beckett and late Joyce are responding to is a breakdown or shift in the attitude towards language, not towards knowledge per se, but even more fundamental. I mean, bearing in mind that what we see in the 20th century, and again, while Joyce may have stopped being an intellectual, I think he certainly would have registered this, and Beckett certainly would, which is the rise of the ordinary language philosophy, the Vienna School, logical positivism, the reduction of the end of metaphysics in the West, the end of anybody being able to sit in a room and speculate about the existence of God or the nature of being. That's all out the window. And how that's registered in prose fiction is the problem with language. How are we going to solve the problem that we cannot, the gap between the world, feeling, and objects and signifiers is beginning to become incommensurable. And Beckett's solution is to say less and to speak more incoherently in order to reflect the incommensurability of language in the world. And Joyce's solution is infill. We'll just chuck more and more words in there and more description and more things in the hope that we can somehow tie language back to the world because it's in danger of kind of floating away. And as for kind of postmodernism, it's a dirty word in my household. It's a meaningless idea. Modernism ain't over. It ain't over until the fat Molly Bloom sings.
Yeah, you mentioned Pynchon. Writers like him, those big 700-page American postmodernists, they seem to me to be the quintessential, the epitome of artistic despair. Despair in the face of the world. This is incomprehensible, so we just have more and more of it. We will not try to refine it. We'll not try to get at an essence. We'll get at quantity. I will learn about, all the things Pynchon knows about.
Right, Stalinism.
Which bore me to death. I don't want to know the things that Pynchon knows about. What I want to know is some tiny essential thing. Yeah, I'm sure he's a great cook. I'm sure he's great at everything. The best book he ever wrote was Crying Blood 49, which is about, 70 pages long. Good book. He should go back to that. But I am trying to make a serious point. I think that compendiousness, that is one large, strong branch of postmodernism, is merely artistic despair in the face of the world.
And on that note,
ladies and gentlemen, we like to end on an up note.
Always end with despair.
Mr. Self
send you out smiling
and Mr. Banville have been exemplary, and I would like you to show your appreciation.
So have you.
no,
Bye.
sorry.